From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, and thanks for coming and spending your lunch with us today. I'm Betsy Peterson, the director of the American Folklife Center here at the Library of Congress, and I want to welcome you to our latest presentation in our ongoing Benjamin Botkin series. The Benjamin Botkin series is an opportunity for us to highlight some of the best scholarship in folklore, ethnomusicology, oral history, and cultural heritage. And it also provides an opportunity for us to enhance our own collections. We see this as part of our acquisitions process. We record the lectures and they become part of our permanent archive and eventually are put up on webcast on our website. So actually, as an aside or corollary to that, if you have your cell phones on, please turn them off at this point. That goes for you too, Simon. Today is a special treat for me. I have the pleasure of introducing a former classmate, a friend, and a colleague, the distinguished folklorist and author Simon J. Bronner. Professor Bronner is the coordinator of the American Studies program, the director of the doctoral American Studies program, and distinguished professor of American Studies and Folklore at Pennsylvania State University in State College. He received his PhD in Folklore and American Studies from Indiana University in 1981, and you can talk to me afterwards about all the stories to be told out of school of that period. But in addition to his demanding schedule and administrative efforts and the work that he's done to establish folklore and American studies at Pennsylvania State University, he's also managed in his spare time to write quite a bit and write quite an impressive number of books. And I need my cheat sheet here to read off some of the titles, but they include Explaining Traditions, Folk Behavior in Modern Culture, American Children's Folklore, which was the winner of the Opie Prize for Best Book on Children's Folklore, Grasping Things, Folk Material Culture and Mass Society, Folk Nation, Folklore in the Creation of American Tradition, and American Folklore Studies, and Intellectual History. He also, in his spare time, edits a book series entitled Material Worlds and the journal Jewish Cultural Studies. So you can get a sense of the wide range of his interests. But the folklore of college campuses have always been of interest to Simon, and he's been documenting in that area for many, many years and has, luckily for us, returned to it recently. This year he is returning to the topic with the publication, or you can tell us when exactly it's coming out, but Campus Traditions. And that's what Simon is going to share with us today, some of his research around that. So please give him a warm welcome. Simon.
Thank you very much, Betsy, and thank you very much for coming out on this occasion. I want to lay out clearly what I'm going to talk about today. It is obviously a glimpse of a much wider topic concerning traditions on college campuses, particularly as it is so much in the news today. I do want to talk about a folkloristic contribution, and especially historically the concern of the change from the old-time college, the small communal kind of institution, to what I call the mega modern university, a behemoth that is much more bureaucratized and much larger in scope. And one of the points that I'm going to make is an historic change where the function of being in college has gone from being a cultural passage to one in which it celebrates an individual working in a mass society and folklore is one of those responses to that transition. I also want to look at the college campus as a particularly odd and curious place in our American landscape. It is a betwixt and between location in many ways, not only between high school and then the adult world, but also between home and residence, between one's parents and one's own friends in that one gains in college. And as a space itself, what I have found is that unlike other institutions that we talk about in America, it is a paradoxical fusion of feudal and modern corporate culture. Finally, I want to focus on what I think epitomizes the first two objectives, and that is the rush and scrap, which I promise I will define for you, claiming that rather than rugby, it is the origin of our modern football, and it epitomizes for me the social psychological reasons for being on campus and what its functions are and how that has changed. And besides talking about the rise and fall of the rush as a custom, it also it merits analysis because of its return or revival. First, a quick little history on the emergence of what we call the American campus. Many of you know that Harvard was established in 1636 as our first college, but it had a yard rather than a campus. William and Mary quickly followed, and with these early institutions, it established a tradition of classical learning. One went to college to become well-rounded and learn Latin, Greek, mythology, and classics toward probably degrees in divinity or perhaps in law. Princeton, I don't know if we have Princeton grads here in the audience, but it deserves credit for creating the campus, which it did do after this classical model, and then colleges expanded very rapidly, so a distinction of the American landscape is a college in your town. There were more colleges in the United States than in any country in Europe by the middle of the 19th century. And one of the other distinctions is the class system of freshmen, sophomore, juniors, and seniors. While these terms were borrowed from the English freshman and sophomore, they became more intense and they became more competitive in the United States than in England. If you look at early prints of some of these early campuses, you notice that they do not have sporting fields or athletic fields. The campus was so named because it did have open greens, which were used by the students for what they called athletics. Customs seemed to come in very early, and there were diaries and accounts about some of these early institutions having customs that were instituted by the students themselves. They weren't organized by any student activities office at that time. That came much later. And what is of interest is that many of these customs are what we would call today rather violent for what we think of as rather the elite segment and a small segment of society. It was primarily male, primarily elite, upper class, and primarily Protestant. As you can see here, there is mention of football as early as 1832, but what they're referring to is more of a piling on, and wrestling, as here depicted in Harper's Weekly in 1899. I do want to make a shout out to early attempts at documenting college folklore, because the fact is that it has been rather neglected, as folklorists want to go out into various kinds of fields and document workers and document singers and musicians and so forth. But Benjamin Homer Hall was a Harvard student, and while he was there, he considered himself an antiquarian, and he started writing in blue books where he should have been doing his Greek and Latin exercises, words that he would hear, and then he would ask about other words outside of Harvard and found, lo and behold, they're similar. Ah, there's the spirit of the folklorist. And he published something in his graduate year of 1851 called A Collection of College Words and Customs. It's still in print. It is invaluable for us. And what I want to focus on is that he took notice of football being the favorite amusement at some of the American colleges during certain seasons of the year. It is customary for the sophomore class to challenge the freshmen to a trial game soon after their entrance into college. This is not intercollegiate sports, but seemed to be an interclass contest. And there is evidence that football arises out of this scrap era of campus life. The scrap defines campus life from a student point of view, especially between 1850 and 1920. As illustrated here in an early print, it was controlled by students who viewed it as central to their campus experience. I should say that administrators resisted the intrusion of athletics upon what they called aesthetics, not academics. They called it aesthetics, indicating that college should be about the uplifting, refining function of their classical learning. And athletics was associated with childishness and brutishness. So what is the rush? It is actually a complex of activities, usually involving a public display of two sides held outdoors on a field. That becomes very important in terms of student control of the campus. It is an interclass contest, usually between the freshmen and the sophomores, often involving a running start and practices of grappling, pushing, pulling of bodies. It gets quite violent, usually knocking opponents to the ground. Are there goals? Many observers thought it was chaos or a riot that they witnessed, but the students would say there is a goal of eliminating one team by pushing them off a certain space or possessing a symbolic object such as a hat, a flag, a cane, or a cider barrel, usually on an area that's central to the campus, such as a quad or a field. A scrap, which was often used synonymously, emphasized a fight at a line. It was also called a brawl, a spree, a scrimmage, and a word that actually comes from European initiations, a rusk, for someone who is rustic. What historians have not pointed out, who have looked at this scene, is that there are precedents for this in children's folklore and in human development, particularly for males. Later on, we can talk about how many of you remember Red Rover, which was also known as Bull Rush, or forcing the city gates and capture the flag. That does seem to have a connection to some of the rules, such as they are with the rush. King of the Hill and Gauntlet, which you will soon see, and of course a play activity, which I wouldn't call a game because it often doesn't have rules, and that is piling on, but it is also called murder ball and pyramids. This is what a freshman likely would see, hardly the welcoming orientation as they're called now. And these were posted, quite creative, I must say. And in fact, students wanted to uphold customs because it was one of their sources of power within the campus field. As you can see here, one night is set aside to post the college customs, and the duty of the sophomore class to see that they are posted. It was their job informally to make sure that one is not only initiated, but also familiar with the customs and would pass it on. The trouble is, there were injuries. This was not for the faint of heart, and it did go public into the press with incidents of broken bones and even of occasional deaths. With that picture on the left that you saw was someone covered in molasses and feathers for disobeying the sophomores. Since Penn State is in the news today for its combination of athletics and academics, and especially with what I consider misinformed comments about the culture at Penn State without any cultural research, I do want to look at a precedent, and that is the Rush controversy at Penn State between 1912 and 1920, which did involve folklorists, Archer Taylor, and someone you're going to see, Fred Lewis Petit there, who got involved with what the use of traditions are to a college campus. And it did involve, as the campus grew, and many campuses across the country grew, this one, the idea that it's getting too large and too dangerous. It started getting the attention of the administration, especially as that they had to answer to the press about hazing and about abuses. And two, the entrance of women on the college campus, which they were starting to come onto campus, and whether this excluded them or not. Penn State was one of the first campuses, in fact, that had a dean of women, for example, to attend to their needs. And as you could see, the faculty started noticing that this was getting very disruptive. It was not something extracurricular. It was starting to intrude upon the curriculum, as in this about false alarms of the scrap. From the standpoint of the instructor, at a certain amount of work to cover within a fixed time, it must be exasperating to have recitations interrupted in this way. What's the answer? Make a committee. And seriously, though, what that committee did was to take a custom which was understood by social contract, what we call a high context group, and to apply rules to it. As you could see here, committee composed of 5 men from each of the 2 upper classes who were to draw up rules for customs that were misunderstood. This also drew the attention of physical educators at the time, who argued whether these athletics run by the students were detrimental to their studies and what its relationship to society was or not. James Naismith, who many of you know as inventing basketball, he's also credited with inventing the football helmet that some people argue about. But he had a stake in this, and his notion was that class contests are a natural condition of student life. There is some instinct, there is some need. But he did call for safety, and rules such as, you can understand, of not using barbed wire climbers to cause serious injury are strictly prohibited. In fact, as faculty, including at Penn State when there was a resolution to ban the rushes, students revolted. This was the cause of student strikes, not so much political unrest at this time. It was about control of the campus. And the ways that students controlled it was through these events, and they certainly were mass events. And I should say that this took on some severity because students, especially at this time, had guns, as you see here, and especially in a hunting culture such as Pennsylvania, this was very common indeed. Fred Lewis Petit defended the students, and he's very important in American studies as the first professor of American literature in the world. And he was also a student of the Grimms in Germany. It was common for scholars to study in Germany at the time. And he came back and he noticed that in Germany, their student custom was to have duels, and often leaving permanent scars. So in his mind, what he said is that the American system of rushes and scraps is actually quite wholesome in comparison. And besides, there is a body of information and counsel passed on by word of mouth from college generation to college generation. He was also concerned in a lot of institutions where the people who began entering college campuses were from the working class, not from the elite. And he thought that these rushes and scrap helped make that transition where they had no precedent before. All right, let me talk to you about some of these traditions and what their texts and behaviors are so you can get a sense. especially if you're not familiar with the revival aspects of some of this. First is the cane rush, and probably the oldest. The cane was a symbol, as you could see here, where the small old-time college, since it wasn't very large, would put actually names on a cane representing the whole class. And then there was a contest for grabbing the cane, which is fine if you have a few people. If you have a lot of them, as you can see at RPI, it starts to degenerate into a mass pants-pulling contest. Here's another photograph showing it. Probably more in northern climes, there was something called the cider rush, which was considered a fall spectacle, often between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and you can get a sense of the mass scene here, in which the goal was either to get as many hands on the cider, which was thought to be much larger than, let's say, the cane, but it also could lead to rather a riotous kind of scene. The flag rush was another answer, especially in peacetime, of a campus that we're looking at the military, and many people see this as a training ground for military kind of loyalty to one's class and grabbing the flag. The trouble is that people got pulled off the poles, which did lead to injury, even if they're not using barbed wire. A fellow by the name of C.G. Bryan suggested push ball as a compromise to keep the rush, but to make it safer, especially with this large ball, so that it could not be hidden like a small football or a rugby ball. People would line up, and basically his idea is that there would be skilled players, much like football, ends and forwards. The trouble is that in the folk version on many campuses, it was a mass riot, as you can see in this image from Penn State. And there were indeed many injuries. There was something called the football rush, which was seen as a culmination of these different kinds of activities. You can see the protective gear, such as it was a nose guard, that was about it. And it was basically a scrum rather than what we think of as the forward pass, although, as you could see here, there were rules, but involving trophies, canes, and hats in many occasions. So this is one of the ways in which it was indeed a culmination. And then the rush did get associated with football, and one of the administrative justifications for it is if they get out their pent-up energies against each other, then they'll leave us alone, especially with the history of student revolts fairly fresh in their mind, as I have highlighted here, which you can see, the voluminous vent for huge masses of superfluous feeling and energy in players and spectators alike, which otherwise would seek and find an outlet in more dubious channels. Psychologically, we can also see the rush having an American aspect because of its association with expansion of the land rushes, and rush probably became more popular than the scrap, for example, and as noted in various slang dictionaries, it became generic for violence in American schools, so a number of kinds of activities and hazing came under the rubric of the rush, including its manliness. Now, one of the changes that did occur, particularly in the 20th century, as there was an attempt to save the rush, is that there were educators, including James Naismith, who thought it could be incorporated into the business world, that the spirit of cooperation and solidarity, of teamwork that comes out of the rush is something that the modern age of organization and industrialism demands. So here you see an early example of functionalism, but perhaps different from the way the students saw it, as a way to break away from parents and high school and get initiated into student loyalty and into campus life. Indicative of this are new kinds of customs that started entering, such as at the University of Michigan, where the loser of the rush here, as you can see, has to propose marriage. so you could see how some of the items have changed to fit this idea of settling down, of being mature, and so forth. Walter Camp is often given the title of the father of American football, and I should note that although it is true that he took note of rugby, many of his novels as well as his books, such as How to Play Football, were in response to what he saw as the disorganization of the rush. He wanted to organize it. He wanted to take it from its folk form and to modernize it and regulate it so as to become more popular. And this is one of the reasons why it became associated with the college game. And then as it expanded nationally, took on the sense of intercollegiate rivalry rather than interclass rivalry. And then even more so, this sense of organization and regulation moved from student control, because even some of the early football teams were controlled by student managers, to this idea of adult managers who were specialists mapping out what looked like bureaucratic charts. This is from the University of Pennsylvania, not to be confused with Penn State. So what happens to the rush? Did they disappear? No, but they certainly went into decline. But arguably, the role that then the rush took on was a parody of itself, which then became a parody of the administration. Because then instead of the pushball rush, you would have things like the rope rush, as you can see here, so that students can see each other tumble to the ground and looking very awkward, and including the pants scrap, which was once a consequence of things like the cane rush. Now they become formalized, come out and see the pants scrap to see these males have their pants pulled down. The other outlet was to have formal tugs of war and gauntlets of the freshman and sophomore class to keep some of the enmity as an idea of the structure of the college campus. This one from the 1920s at Penn State, and here's an example of a gauntlet with shillelaghs that you might think of again in reference to children's folklore as running the mill. But this was very common, and there would also be pajama parades, hobo parades that often involved a running through the gauntlet. In this case, they are dressed in regular clothes. Very often they would be dressed in nightshirts, was another common aspect. Another kind of folk form that was localized were various activities that I call scatological, and I will show you why in a minute. The mud rush at Cornell that gained quite a reputation, the tank rush on the West Coast, the flower rush at Penn, which basically meant that students soiled each other. How it ended was a little unclear because it seemed to be a tumult, but this is also a challenge to the folklorists because it's not a clear set of rules or a beginning to an end that we can document, but we're rather documenting the behavior and asking what the motivations and outcomes are. The grease stick rush, interestingly, at RPI, you can see a photograph of it there. And I don't think it's a stretch, in fact, to suggest that there is something of an anal stage which is revived in the campus scene as one of these ideas that you enter into the campus scene. And although Freud talked mainly about childhood anal stage that comes at a point when the child is being controlled or repressed and then realizes that play with feces disgusts the parent and so becomes a point of contention and of control. I see a revival of this, in fact, occurring in the pattern of these kinds of events. Another variation of this kind of symbolic communication of students of activities that they know will draw the ire of administrators or perhaps look childish or comical is the handing of an artifact, usually a phallic one, to either losers or to the ugliest person in the class or the dumbest person to the class. It is probably best known at RPI as the toot screw for the institute screw with the double entendre of the screw, but I should point out that there are variations at Harvard of the jackknife being given to this unlikely student, and at Yale of the wooden spoon. And in fact, it's emblazoned there. Now, this is Berkeley, and I will tell you this is not a political protest of the 1960s, but in fact is a rush. Oops, excuse me. And it does lead to talking about functions from the student point of view, especially this idea of class spirit and loyalty, of solidarity, not of individualism. Some of the notions of the fall of the rush did come about as in locus parentis became stronger, and the feminization of the college campus, which I had mentioned earlier. There tended not to be rushes for the women, although I do have some articles referring to the back hair rush, with hair as a symbol of women's power that would be pulled off in this mass scrum that would occur at women's colleges. There was also a decline of the class system, the very intense freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, as schedules started to be individualized by major rather than by what you did as a class. If we were gathered together at an old-time college, we would all be in the same classes. That would not be the case today, where 50 people would have 50 different schedules. And also, I have to say, especially with injuries and the idea of pain and suffering, a litigious society where there was a fear of liability. So my contention is that the rush became a kind of deep play, which became a metaphorical place for contention with the administration and what the role is, especially of activity and liveliness, to the sedentary stillness of academics at the time. It certainly was hierarchical and competitive and did have a value of social dominance, the idea that you gain value by dominating or even defeating others. And there was this evolutionary metaphor of moving up in 4 years, which is a symbol itself of more than enough, with the idea that in this liminal stage you are indeed growing up. You are going from being babies, as you can see here in a Columbia yearbook, to being adults capable of courtship and of dressing up. And you could see around here is this idea that nonetheless they are lively. You see there are no classroom scenes for the class of 1898. That this became the mark of the difference and the fear, in fact, again using Freudian terms, that a sole devotion to academics would be stultifying. So why this enemy between the freshmen and sophomores? Shouldn't they be in solidarity? There is something called the narcissism of minor differences, again from Freud, where the idea is that you create separation from those who are like you. So the battle between the freshmen and sophomores, while they should be in solidarity against the upperclassmen, is a mark that the sophomores are different from the freshmen who just preceded them before. There's also this theory of male aggression, that one of the reasons there's this kind of custom, especially at campuses where you had so many men in close proximity, often sleeping together, is that it was one of the ways in what Freud called a reaction formation, to show that you could not be accused of homosexuality, or that there was this function of intimacy that can be played out with your fellow mates, with your classmates, but through violence. There's also this idea of the oppression transference theory that reverses what the administrators thought, that, okay, let them battle each other so they won't bother us, with the idea that because they were suppressed by the administration in curfews and in rounds of required activities and repression of some of these kinds of athletics, that they were taking the oppression that they felt and trying to work against each other. All right, fast forward to the present in this final section. I see signs of revival or of transformation. And this raises questions about how endemic this is and what it means. Wabash is an all-male college, and what you see here are pots, as they're called there, or beanies or dinks that are being brought back. Also, there's signs that the rush is being taken up by fraternities and sororities, particularly as fraternities and sororities in the Greek system see themselves as upholders of tradition on the college campus and of spirit, college spirit and loyalty. Another aspect is that these customs are an alternative to what has replaced initiations on many campuses with orientations that have more therapeutic activities but don't have some of the social functions that these customs had. I underline here, for example, an article that claimed that the pot has exploded into a phenomenon of renewed tradition. Why is that of concern? Princeton, which you saw earlier, that holds claim to campus tradition. This is an actual poster. You can see, "Come join the tradition." The rhetoric is of Princeton's oldest intramural event since 1869, a kind of legacy appeal, which now does include women. In terms of the scatological function, unless you think that that's a stretch, I also point to Georgetown College's Grub Fest, or Mud Rush, which the campus student website in fact says itself. It is undoubtedly Georgetown's dirtiest tradition. It goes against all of your mother's admonitions. You see what I mean about some of the separation from parents, which can be transferred to administrators as well. And there is a transformation that occurs as a result from a lush green open area indicating control to a socializing and studying into a slimy, muddy arena covered with food products. Administration wants to promote on their website Songfest, but the students themselves rate Grubfest as their top tradition, and you could see some of the maleness appropriated by the women here, showing their flexing their muscles. The fraternity and sorority example can be seen in something like this. This is an SMU. There are traditional chants for those of you interested in oral tradition. They're lining up. These are the ones who are already inducted, and they're going to rush against the pledges. One can say this is transforming the symbolism of solidarity rather than of enmity. They all grab each other, and you'll see another example of that. This is at the University of Missouri. I think maybe the largest spectacle of this kind of thing. You see nice even lines, and then in terms of the behavior and praxis that folklorists pay attention to ethnographically, you're going to see one huge scrum or embrace very quickly. And control of the quad, control of the field. I especially have been documenting something called the storming of the arch. This is the arch. If you want to continue the Freudian interpretation, you can definitely see this idea of defending the entranceway or defending penetration. And at least in 2008, this is what the freshmen looked like, this ragtag bunch, trying to show that they're indeed superheroes. And they're up against uniformed sophomores, and part of the symbolism here is, of course, the sophomores or the administration are uniformed and organized, and the freshmen are not. And you can also see how they line up here on the field, here in front of the arch, so you have this long way to run as if you're trying to penetrate, and they do indeed have oral tradition. They're basically trying to grab each other down to the ground. There are injuries, which I was not supposed to photograph, but they do occur. The administration tried to shut it down several times, but they decided to let it go because the students were meeting surreptitiously to have this tradition, and they were worried that if it's not at least monitored, then things will be worse. Here's just a quick look at it. Many of you who believe in sports, this will not look like a sport, but it's not supposed to. That's part of my point, which is part of the way they want to retain its folkness. So this is just 2008. This is not 1920s. You have to tell me later if you think this is fun. And they repeat this 10 times. 10 times. And usually some people who have injuries are weeded out. But the freshmen have never penetrated the arch, which is, I think, part of the point. But something that does happen is that if you participate, you are baptized. You're sprinkled with water, bottled, and given a new name. So if this is not a sign of initiation into a college campus, I don't know what is, but I think it makes a very strong case for this function here. There have been other attempts to bring back pushball at Yale, where it was banned after it got out of hand and they started bringing the ball onto the streets of New Haven. But there have been attempts to revive it more recently, and also as part of Earth Day to bring Earth Ball Rush into various campuses, although this can also degenerate, as you could see, into a scrum. Whether this is a natural tendency of campus life or not, decide. Another contested tradition that I see as similar is of the Herndon climb. The U.S. Navy has threatened to shut it down several times because they think it's unbecoming of the gentlemen of the Navy. It basically involves climbing this pole here, this monument that is greased with lard, and often what has to happen is that there is this Dixie cup hat which is replaced by someone willing to climb on top. Another contested one moving out west, so you don't think that all of the campuses with an anxiety issue are on the East Coast, is at UC Davis, where there was something called the Battle of the Quad. This was spontaneous, was organized by the students. The administration shut it down after one of the students put a lead pipe in one of the noodles that you will see. And they wanted to replace it with a spring fest that was organized by the administration, but it wasn't as popular. This is basically it. This is what happens. They're noodles. They're pool noodles, which will not hurt you, except some of the creative students also created these catapults. I don't know if they were medieval studies majors or not, to throw food and things at the other person. All right, in conclusion, and you've been very patient, I look forward to a discussion with you about what's happening in the college campus, as I said, especially in light of concerns about the relationships of student athletics to academics on campuses and what campus culture, as that word has been thrown around, means. is one, the aging gender development. Our campus is any longer a place for human development, especially as there is this economic concern of the function of colleges, but are they still a place where passage occurs, where there is some transition from adolescence to adulthood? Secondly, the college has an organizational power that is a power struggle between this feudal and corporate kind of political economy that is played out through traditions that students usually want to control, and the administration is concerned about liability and safety. The other is the mass university and the growth of universities generally, and traditions that are possible on such a mass scale, and especially as they take on values other than these male hierarchical elite values that we saw earlier on. So I thank you for your patience. These are some thoughts, and they're also carried through in other aspects of campus traditions, but I tried to present ones to you today that epitomize the kind of analysis that is possible on the college campus as a field for folkloristic work. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering, in terms of the makeup of the student body of the campuses that you examined, is there a difference in terms of, ethnic and racial diversity in these campuses? Do they tend to be more homogenous? Is that a consideration that some of you take forward?
Well, that's a great question, and especially because of trying to be able to correlate region, ethnicity, religion, or size to these kinds of customs. One quick answer is that this struggle through traditions is occurring on campuses large and small and throughout the United States, although it seems more intense in the United States than it does, for example, in Europe, where I taught, and people would always be at, well, what's all this thing with campuses and residential life? But at the same time, there are places that have a discourse about tradition that has much more at stake about how it's played out. The South is a big place, but a lot of the Southern colleges want to play up tradition and heritage as part of their appeal. Not only the small liberal arts colleges, but even the larger ones, to say, why go to the University of Georgia, the University of Tennessee? Because we're part of the South and we care about tradition. The Yankees do not. But of course, that's a certain fiction or a meta-folklore, because at a lot of college campuses in New England that pride themselves on being old liberal arts colleges, there is this idea, if we're going to have the campus as a place for belonging, we need distinctive traditions. We want to do things at Bowdoin or at Colby or at Hartwick that we don't do elsewhere. So some of the traditions are indeed invented because of this notion we want to do something that's distinctive to us. Now, a Juniata that I showed you, which is in Pennsylvania, they're very aware that they're in the shadow of much larger institutions, and this is part of the reason if you go to the website, they will say, we're a place that has traditions. And one of the ways that the administration has taken on the storming of the arch is that it's an example of something that's unique. It is not unique, but this is part of their cosmology, if you will. Women's colleges, I will say, also play up the discourse of tradition, especially in moving up day, this idea of passage. Why go to a women's college in the modern coeducational age? Well, one of their arguments is that it's a place for solidarity, it's a place for traditions, and so forth. So it would take a whole nother lecture to go through each of them, but I will say that there, just to summarize, that there are certain categories that very much are concerned about tradition, and sometimes this gets into the public press. For example, part of the book is about marching band culture and the controversy of whether the marching bands in historically black colleges and universities justify or tolerate hazing much more than at other places because of the cachet there is to being part of a marching band in those institutions. And they have traditions all their own. They have segments of the band that have their own initiations in addition to the band. It's very much in the news now, but it has a long folkloristic history. Yes.
At the next question, if you could repeat the question into the microphone so that our tape will pick it up.
Yes.
Could you elaborate a little bit on what you call the use of wording of campus culture and state?
Yes. No, I'd be glad to, because the quote, which I actually have, by Mark Emmert is that if you find yourself in a place where the athletic culture is taking precedence over academic culture, then a variety of bad things can occur. There are a couple ways to analyze that. One is there any research on whether the athletic culture predominates over the academic? And the answer is no. This was a conclusion from the behavior of 3 people, which I think is an unfortunate jump. Because my experience in that culture is that, at least whether you believe this is a public display or not, but the belief system was that Penn State was not recruiting as well as others because it was a very strict academic culture. It was a place where you would be kicked out if you didn't go to class. It did not have separate athletic dorms as other institutions was. It was trying to emphasize that it's an academic location. Now, one change that did occur, which you could say is more structural than cultural, is that the football team was put under the finance department rather than under the control of academics. I was on the academic committee at one time that oversaw athletics. And so there's an issue that I do not see the statement of the athletic culture being predominant. The other question is, so what? What if it is predominant? As part of this history shows, this is an evolution, and it's actually something that students fought for, to have athletics integrate into academics. Now, one could argue that what has happened is that, remember, the feudal to the corporate side, it has moved too much to the corporate side, and there has to be more of a monitoring or control to make sure that that's integrating. I would suggest a lot of jobs for folklorists as monitors of customs on various campuses, and that does occur in some student activities kinds of offices. But generally, the integration is something that students find helps them to participate into campus life. It makes that transition, and also it gives them much more of a social sense. Now, another aspect is whether, as you could see in this slide, part of the reason I show you this is the entire Penn State student, faculty, and administrative body at one time. You cannot do that today. Whether campuses are too large to manage, and whether the experience of students now is more as spectators, as passive receivers of athletics rather than those who participate. You saw earlier, I mentioned James Naismith and Fred Petit, who believe that one of the values of the college experience is of participating with others in these kinds of activities. And I know I defied what you promised me to do, and I hope people understood that the question was an answer to how do I apply some of what I'm studying to the situation at Penn State, which I did get a little bit into the book, but it will come out, it finished being in press before the announcement of the NCAA sanctions and the statements, which I think are being challenged, including by some of my colleagues, and generally it is critical of the conclusions about culture. Yes, Audrey.
You know, I'm sure that every generation sends its kids off to college hoping they won't be injured, but the baby boomers the baby boomer helicopter mom that didn't let these kids go out without a helmet or with shin guards. And I wonder if this revival of these is in any kind of response to how protected these kids were, or if anything about litigation. There's some,
Right.
if you have to get a scratch on someone's head, they sue. So do you see any impact of that, or?
The question that's being answered is whether the impact, whether it's a reaction to or the impact of the concern of baby boom parents about the protection of their children, particularly as they remember that there were these instances of activities that could be quite dangerous. And that gets us into the whole area of hazing. And I am also writing and speaking about that at the next American Folklore Society meeting. I did organize a session about how folklorists respond to hazing, because hazing suggests damage rather than tradition and passage, and it becomes complicated. But the quick answer that I would say, because it's a whole complicated issue, I'm not ducking it, but it becomes difficult, is that it is true, especially when I was an administrator, that we're constantly consulting lawyers. One could say that lawyers are running a lot of the policies that we have about concerns about safety, about legality, especially as some of these earlier campuses were really closed campuses. Now it's really difficult to insulate a college campus. They're open spaces. The campus was framed, it was bounded, and that's difficult to keep people out, or to have something like you have at the airport to know who goes in and out. It's even difficult to monitor what students are going to spontaneously organize, as you saw at that epic battle of the quad, especially I would say in the era of social media with flash mobs and so forth. And I know that's not very comforting for many of you parents who have children in college. I will say administrations are very concerned about safety and all kinds of training and workshops, but and this is why you have some of this tussle between students who want this metaphor of conflict, who want this sense of initiation, but this comes up against administrative concerns about safety and legal concerns about safety. So sometimes student needs are causing their own problems. Yes.
I have to say, I remember my daughter did storm the arch at Juniata, and I said, "You're going to do what now?"
Better you don't know.
Yeah, right. Now I see. I didn't know what it was really involved.
A very proud tradition there.
Did you look at all at how alcohol interacts with any of this stuff, and the appreciation of the traditions and whether they continue?
I did, and it is true that a lot of the abuse, and this is one of the theories, that the problem is not so much about the traditions, but when drugs and alcohol get involved, that there's often abuse. And now a lot of campuses, most campuses, are alcohol and drug-free spaces, but again, how do you enforce that completely?
It also sounds like there's a lot, I mean, in terms of alums and, say, football and partying at football games, that there's also actually a benign attitude from some alum towards the incorporation of alcohol in some of these traditions. I mean, it's not necessarily always considered a bad thing.
Yeah, and popular culture does get involved too, because I talk about things like beer pong, for example. There are sports, very formal sports competitions for beer pong, for example, from being a folk drinking game. And some of that goes underground as a result, where it was more above ground, and we can have a conversation about whether it's better when it's above ground so that you can moderate it more.
I just wanted to ask you about the turn rush.
Yeah.
In your lecture, you implied that the sorority fraternity part of it, that was introduced
Later.
fairly recently. I mean, term rush has always been associated with fraternity and sorority, and I wonder when that kind of linkage happened, or if you came across
Yeah,
that.
it's a good historical question. What Betsy asked is about the terminology of rush, since it's so well known with fraternities and sororities today, whether that indeed came after. It is at least my contention from the research I've done that it did come after. First of all, a lot of fraternities and sororities started emerging in the mid-19th to the late 19th century. So that's already after the Russian scrap period when they're specifically referred to the rush. I think they start taking on this notion of rush partly because of what you saw, that there's this idea of embrace after enmity between the pledges and the actives, as they're called. And so they all get together in what looked like a rush kind of system. But the word itself seems to be an Americanism, not found in Europe, although there has been some speculation whether there's a transitional term of the rusk, because that does occur in some medieval European ceremonies where the idea is that the freshmen would have horns that are filed down so that they're literally changed. And the beanie comes from there as well. And there's also this appeal of the scrap to the popularity of boxing in America too, or those are some of the ideas. As you could see, I also have this idea that there's a certain appeal with the control of the campus field because of this idea of land rush and the importance of the control of the land as a control of the institution. Well, I've been told that that's the last question, but again, I thank you. I will be glad to talk to you afterwards. And again, thank you very much for coming out. Let me know what traditions you remember and what you see today. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.